Well, I am really excited about our guest today. I've interviewed him before, but I never saw him in person. We did it just by phone, but right now we are on Zoom here. And he, along with his co authors, just wrote this book, Making Your Crazy Work for You, From Trauma and Isolation to Self Acceptance and Love. And we're going to be speaking with Mark B. Borg, Jr., PhD. And he also wrote it with a psychiatrist, Grant H. Brenner, MD, and Daniel Berry. But we're just going to be speaking with our wonderful guest, Mark, today. And so here is the book, and I have been reading it. Here we go. And I love the exercises, really great. So, Mark, first of all, let's have you just tell you a little bit about your background.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I am from Southern California. I was born and raised in Newport Beach, a surfer, and when I was in my my late teens, I myself, was having a bit of struggle, and so I launched out of Newport Beach and wound up in the United States Army. And the Army gave me this incredible GI Bill that I was able to use to go to college. So I started going to college, still a little bit drifting, and I got in just a little bit of trouble, and I was sentenced to do 1,000 hours of community service at a developmental center. And believe it or not, that changed my life. Working with people, caring for people. From there, I went on and got a job at a psychiatric hospital for adolescents. I worked there for 4 years, and then I somehow managed to get my way into a PhD program where I got my degree in community and clinical psychology. And I wound up moving to New York City, becoming a psychoanalyst and starting this practice and seeing throughout all of these years, and we're going back to 1988 when I started, when I was sentenced into this field. And
it was your greatest gift.
It was the greatest gift. It was the greatest. It really was. It was like, talk about turning tragedy into absolute, really, I would say at this point in my life, gratitude. I am so grateful because of all the things that the people along the way, especially my clients, have taught me. And one of the things that I kept seeing over and over and over again in all these years are these kind of caretaking operations. And I at first thought of it as what I even called it human antidepressant. I thought that I was seeing, and I was, but all of these ways in which people were trying to help other people in ways that were sort of imposing help. They were forcing help. They were trying to make people better, whether or not the person actually wanted to be better. And I was seeing that these attempts at treating other people were failing. So I started writing a book called Are You a Human Antidepressant? Interestingly, I had joined with 2 other authors who were not Grant and Danny. And what I realized in the operation of writing that book was that I was trying to be a human antidepressant to the other 2 authors who had come to me because they were miserable. One of them had been left by a boyfriend for the 3rd time. The other one was really struggling with substance abuse and addiction. And I'm like, what am I doing here? And so, of course, that project, Are You a Human Antidepressant, totally wiped out. Fortunately, at that time, I knew Grant Brenner because he was the medical director at my institute, and I knew Danny Berry because he lives in my neighborhood and we'd become pals. And so I started talking to those guys about the project, the Human Antidepressant Project, and they're like, that's interesting. Maybe we can all come together because the thing wiped out, it ruptured, and maybe the 3 of us work to repair whatever the rupture was in the Human Antidepressant Project. And we started looking at this dynamic that I'm talking about, this, like, you could call it helpaholism, or you could call it compulsive caretaking. We were looking at that dynamic. And that as a more like a pathology. Like, I am pathological because I'm trying to impose help on you. Instead, we started to think maybe this isn't a pathology. Maybe instead of being a human antidepressant that perpetrates help on other people, maybe this is actually a dynamic system that 2 people create together. So instead of being human antidepressant, we started thinking of it as an operation, a psychological defense system that 2 people create together to defend themselves from the most scary aspects of long-term relationship, especially love. And so we started thinking that this thing that we were looking at was a co-created psychological defense against intimacy, empathy, vulnerability, and emotional investment. And instead of calling it human antidepressant, which is something you do to somebody, we started calling it interrelationship, which is something you do with somebody. So that's kind of the road that got me to where we are right now, which is we took that co-created psychological defense system called interrelationship, and we started exploring how it actually exists in each individual mind, hence self-interrelationship, which is the topic of this book.
Right, right.
Woo!
So your first book was Irrelationship.
Yeah.
And so define that for everybody, because they don't hear that word very often. You have a lot of words that you've blended together that have a specific meaning.
Right. For us, interrelationship is the co-created psychological defense system that two people quite inadvertently and really quite ironically create to defend themselves against the anxieties that come with the scarier aspects of love. Again, the four things, the four pillars of love, which are empathy, intimacy, vulnerability, and emotional investment. So here we are, let's say two people, we've fallen in love, we go through the honeymoon period, everything's so exciting, but then we start running into what I call the intimacy of everyday life, where we actually are challenged to accept each other and ourselves as we actually are. You don't know that in the honeymoon period. Sometimes you don't know that for several years, but as the dust settles, you start to realize that real intimacy isn't like, hey, we're having wild sex. Real intimacy is, hey, we're having big problems. Like, hey, we're having great conflict. And how in the world are we possibly going to live with each other in what starts out as a state of deep disappointment? Well, for some of us, rather than actually accepting ourselves and the other person as we are, we start these operations, right? We start offering care. We start forcing ourselves. We start forcing these solutions. We start performing. We actually call one of the positions in your relationship the performer and the other position the audience. The performer does all that performing, like, oh, I'm good, I'm right, I'm funny, I'm silly, I'm talented, I'm all of the, sometimes I'm absent, you know, whatever it is that I do to care for you, I'm doing it like this. So the interesting thing about your relationship is it's a caretaking, but it's actually a caretaking that defends against allowing other people to care for us. And that's the irony.
Like the old, is it similar to the old codependent,
See,
like codependent no more?
Right. No, and we love that book and we've been very inspired by it. And we've written articles about the difference between your relationship and codependency.
So how do you
see, human antidepressant was very, very similar to codependent, very similar. But interrelationship has a major difference in that in codependency, I still am doing something as a person to someone else. I'm still trying to fix them. I'm trying to heal them. I'm involved in their addiction. They originally actually called codependency co-alcoholism because that's what they thought it was. And it was, and it is. But we actually have twisted the model and turned it into something not that you do to somebody, but something that you do with somebody. And that takes us to the other positions. Here, I described the performer because the performer looks more like the codependent who's trying to help. The codependent maybe is going to Al-Anon. The codependent who like thrives on trying to get other people better. That's the performer. But in our model, there's also an audience. And the audience has a great, great, great part in the dynamic system of your relationship because the audience is the person who operates in the system to act as if what the performer is giving actually works. When it doesn't. So it's really interesting because the audience winds up having immense power. The audience has this power to act as if what the other person is offering actually helps up to a certain point. And your relationship starts to break down when the audience is like, you know what? I'm not buying it anymore. And the reality is when you're giving like a fire hose, you're like, you're giving in a way that doesn't allow any of the efforts or the care that the other person is offering to get in.
Right.
And so the audience also does that. They're giving a weird presentation of a self who's actually being helped, cured, rescued, whatever that is.
Right.
But really they're giving in a way to that acting as if state that doesn't allow anything that the performer has to offer to get in. So what happens in this case is the performer feels resentful. I'm giving and giving and giving and giving, and you're acting like, you know, you're not grateful. You're, you know, like I've seen people beat their chest and say, I pay the rent, I'm paying for therapy, I'm paying the bills, I'm paying the whatever. And I'll say, stop being so selfish.
Yeah.
Because again, if you're not taking in what the other person has to offer, what's the message?
Right. Right.
The message is you got nothing good to give.
Right. 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 Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about crazy.
Right.
Because
Okay.
the name of this book is Making Your Crazy Work for You. So how do you define crazy in this book? And
Crazy. Okay. So if I'm giving the way I just described, right? I'm giving, and it's operating as a psychological defense against allowing you to give anything to me.
Mhm.
What that actually winds up creating is a state of total isolation.
Mhm.
Absolute isolation. And we know as human beings that the worst form of punishment that we can perpetrate upon another human being is solitary confinement. So
Right.
emotionally, what we do in a relationship is we are so busy caretaking and not letting anything that the world has to offer in, that we basically defend ourselves so thoroughly against any contribution that anybody else in the world has to offer that we wind up isolating ourselves, and we wind up in that horrible state of loneliness that is really among the worst possible human experiences one can have.
Right.
And so you have two people, and this is where it gets weird, because there's all these couples that are coming to me, as their couple therapist, and going like, what's wrong? Like, here we are, we've been together for 20 years, we've got kids, we've got income, we've got resources, we've got all this kind of stuff, and we're desperately lonely. We are so lonely. There's like, why are we lonely? On the surface, it all looks fine. I'm making this much money and we've got this kind of life established. And we take these vacations. We do all the, I go off to the Hamptons because I live in New York, all these kinds of things. Why am I so lonely?
Right.
So this
You're
is our
more lonely than you would be alone.
Yeah. And that loneliness, I think, right, exactly. And that lonely, because it's ensconced in what looks like a decent relationship, is so confusing that it drives people crazy. Yeah. It drives us crazy because everything on the surface looks like a good life. Everything on the surface can look like a good life, because what a psychological defense's job is, its job is to decrease. Here's the most important thing I can possibly say to anyone in my practice. A psychological defense decreases our awareness of anxiety. What I said was, it decreases our awareness of anxiety, but it does not decrease our anxiety. So what happens is the anxiety that is now blocked from awareness can run rampant, and it can manage our life. It can completely control us. I can completely cut myself off, but because it's working, because it's functional, I'm not aware of the anxiety that's now like the animals are out of the cages in the zoo, right? And
no insight whatsoever, right. Just living and going through the motions. That's and right. Doing all the things that society says are right.
That's right.
Earning the money, taking care of the kids, doing whatever, going out with friends. Yeah, but there's no intimacy, there's no connection.
Right. In fact, the caretaking operation that operates to protect the other ourselves from taking in what the other person has to offer is being now driven by terrible anxiety. And not only that, it's also being kind of got a combination of deep anxiety combined with this isolation. So what tends to happen at its depths, as we realize that people don't wind up in a relationship by accident. That what happens usually, we find, if we trace it back to childhood, we find caregivers, parents, who are not really able to caretake. What does a child do when a caretaker can't caretake? A child reverses the roles and does everything they possibly can to care for the parent. What does that look like? Sometimes it looks like acting as if the parent is actually providing effective care. Because the last thing that a parent who is ineffective wants to know about themselves is that they're a bad parent, right?
Right.
So the kid does this magical miracle thing, which is they find all kinds of incredibly creative strategies to make the parent feel as if they're a decent caregiver, or at least good enough in the words of Donald Winnicott, right? So so interestingly, it looks kind of like, from that position, that everybody starts out as an audience. Everybody starts out, every person in a relationship winds up like acting as if the parent is doing a good enough job, and then maybe goes on to become a performer who actually creates all these wonderful, you can be good, you can be funny, you can be right, you can be absent, you can be smart, you can do all these things to make the parent feel like, oh, I'm doing a pretty good job.
Real successful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my
Yep.
kid's so successful, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so this interesting thing that this book really explores is what we call self-relationship. And at first, look, Dr. Grant Brenner, my colleague, my ally, my peer, my co-author, kept pushing this idea like, come on, what about the relationship we have with ourselves? What about the relationship we have with ourselves? Like you and I were talking about before the meeting here, before this interview. At first, I'm like, yeah, I get the relationship with oneself, but your relationship is a co-created psychological defense system. Isn't this oxymoronic? I mean, how in the world could irrelationship be self-irrelationship? And that's where we started looking into trauma. That's where we started looking into the work of people like Bessel van der Kolk and Janina Fisher and Daniel Shaw. We started looking at these incredible authors, Judith Herman. We look at Harry Stack Sullivan, Eric Fromm, all these people, Freud himself. Like all these people who were talking, Pierre Janet, talking about trauma for the last 100 years. Harold Searles, all these incredible thinkers, and we started thinking, wait a minute. There's one thing to be traumatized, because it is trauma to have an ineffective caretaker, right? That's trauma. No matter what you make of it, we need our parents to be parents.
Sure.
And the fact that a relationship exists suggests the lengths at which we will go to turn our parents into parents, i.e. caretakers.
Right.
But there are some situations that are so traumatic, that are so devastating, that the effects of a relationship happen by creating splits in the self. That there are parts of ourselves that are split off and can't interact with each other. They can't, like this part of me that had this terrible trauma gets split off so that it's not in any kind of communication with this other part of me who maybe found a way to access resiliency and to function and to overcompensate for the terrible trauma. But what we believe, based on contemporary trauma theory, is that these splits, these dissociated parts of ourselves still exist. And that they're out there, they're in there somewhere, still needing attention and care. And so self-relationship becomes this way in which the mind protects itself from being known fully, from having an integrated sense of self. And so in a funny way, we become completely cut off from ourselves. Because, we also believe as psychoanalysts, especially relational interpersonal psychoanalysts, that each experience of a significant other can also create an experience of self. So there's this self-other interaction that literally gets split off. And our book is all about trying to reintegrate, to reassociate the dissociated experiences of self that we experienced through basically ineffective caretaking when we were young.
Right. So kind of we repeat that in our relationships. I always think about, did I marry my mother or did I marry my father? Or maybe one part of my life, I married my mother. And another part of my life, I married my father. And I think that's, my first husband, I think I married my mother. And now with this husband, I think I married my father. I look and I say, oh my gosh, I'm going through these things. And I think that the key is that you talk about is becoming aware.
Yeah.
Once you're aware, I asked my husband, I took a couple of your questions from your book. By the way, I'll mention your book again and show it again. Yes, making your crazy work for you. So I asked a couple of the questions and and it was funny the answer I got from my husband. I said something to him like, so do you ever notice yourself doing something like that your parents did? That was one of the things that you had in there. And he goes, and I noticed that about myself, and he goes, I try not to think about it.
Right, exactly.
It was perfect because people don't want to think about it, right?
We don't want to think about it. That's why, that's why in a weird way, we're kind of fortunate when we actually experience the loneliness in the relationship, because that's the red signal.
It forces us.
Yeah.
It forces us to say why. But we can't be stuck in that, there are people who will go through psychoanalysis for 30 years. I mean, I always think of Woody Allen or something.
Who's not a great, he's not a great poster child for us.
No, he's not.
Right?
No. But I see these people that are kind of get stuck in, well, I'm like this because my mother was like this, or my father was like this. And I think the beauty of your book, as I'm reading it and doing the exercises, is that what you do is you kind of look at yourself. You don't have to be like your mother or father was.
Right. That's right.
And that's the beauty. We don't, it's you're beyond blame, right?
That's right. In fact, we have a wildly optimistic view of whatever it is we're trying to resolve, because we say, hey, you may marry your mother, you may marry your father, but what you're really marrying is your unresolved family conflict. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful to think, hey, my parents did the best they could. They left us with this family conflict. They did as good as they took it as far as they could. But now I'm going to have a better understanding of their conflict, and I'm actually going to work it out with my partner. And like you said before we started, like, I can work it out with my wife, I can work it out with my husband, I can work it out with my best friends, I can work it out with my colleagues, the way I do with Grant Brenner and Danny Barry in our project. Like, we have done, Danny and Grant and I have had to do so much work. We've had to do so much work ourselves to be able to keep going. We've been working on this project since 2010. I mean, we've been.
Well, you teach, I always say, as a teacher myself, I say, always teach what what you need to learn.
That's exactly brilliant. That's brilliant. That's exactly, that's
right?
So right on, because there have been times where I've gone like, people have said, what's it like being like in this, now coming on 12-year project with these two, kind of funky dudes from New York City, three funky dudes from New York City. And I'm like, it's
former
like a
surfer.
marriage. Yeah, cowabunga, right? I'm like, it's like a marriage. And not all of us are comfortable with the analogy of marriage, but I really think that a good marriage is really, really, really requires what the developmental psychologists today are calling rupture and repair, right?
Yeah.
Rupture is inevitable. It's what you do with it that counts, right?
Yeah.
If we rupture, oh, what a bummer. Oh, I'm not in the honeymoon anymore. Oh, I'm tumbling into this terrible state, where things are disappointing and blah, blah, blah. But what an opportunity. Because every single rupture is an opportunity for repair. And every single repair is like calisthenics for the relationship.
I wanted to name our book when Leonard and I did our book. I wanted to name our book The Gift of Conflict.
Yeah, I love that.
But only you would love it. Everybody else hated it.
I love it. My wife and I.
Because it is. I know. Oh, but I have to laugh. A therapist would love it. We loved it.
Oh, I think it's so great, because conflict's my favorite word.
But that's why we called it Fighting for Love, turn conflict.
Yeah. Oh, I like that too.
Yeah. That one, people could okay, I can get into that, but people go,
no, actually, I love it. I love that
conflict in a gift, but there is a gift. Yeah. If it's like the Chinese word for conflict is made of two symbols, danger and opportunity.
Right.
So it can be a danger if you just say, go to hell, I don't need to listen to you, I don't, or it could be like, wow, I didn't even realize that I did that.
That's right.
Let's talk about it. Wow, where did that come from? That kind of thing, that curiosity.
I love that. And I love your title. It's so funny because my wife and I are working on a book. We actually got a contract through the same publisher here. And the book was originally called Alternatives to Divorce and Medication. And everybody hates it. Like, oh, it's so negative. But really it's kind of like your title would be perfectly fit for our book. I love that. Fighting for Love is exactly what we're talking about. And Rupture and Repair is so wildly optimistic. I mean, it's hard for us to really understand and comprehend how optimistic it really is, especially when you're in a state in your relationship where things are tough. Look, things are tough right now. People have been cornered by their relationship now we have a mansion because we have a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 bathrooms. This is a mansion in New York. But for most people on the planet, like, this is like a little hub that we're stuffed into, 4 of us. Right. And so again, like with my project with Danny and Barry, my wife and my 2 beautiful, wonderful, incredible children, we've had to really figure a lot of this stuff out too. We've had to go like, okay, we wiped out, the family wiped out. What are we going to do? We're going to give up. We're going to tell each other to go to hell. Well, we can't really do that. So what do we do? We're going to make use of every rupture to repair and come back into a better state, into a more complex state, into a more complex understanding and acceptance of ourselves and each other as we are. I love it. You know,
that's the opportunity.
Yeah.
The opportunity is there to, like you said, and I like the question that you really look within, because isn't it all about us? I mean, I learned that, you know, being married the first time 18 years, and now I'm with Lloyd like 30 years. And so, you know, I learn. And the thing is, it's really all about me. And it's me being able to say, gee, you know, that hurts. I don't know why that hurts so bad, you know, and then I have to think, well, what does it remind me of when I was a kid? You know, I have to ask myself these questions. And so it's all about, my word for this year, which has been kind of is mindfulness.
You know? That's really good.
Because like you said, your questions, and I love the questions in this book, you know, for each chapter has exercises, and those exercises are so important. And if you can't do it with your lover or your husband or your wife or your whatever, find someone who's on the same path.
That's right. Well, that Danny and Grant and I, that's what we do. Danny and Grant and I like pull all these questions out for a test drive ourselves. You know, we found out like really important things about ourselves and each other. I mean, things that we kind of realize that every relationship is actually an opportunity, not just for us to, of course, we think it's about accepting the other person, but like what we're saying is it's really about accepting myself. And it's about, you know, understanding that intimacy is that place where the other person is a mirror. The other person has seen so much of us, not because we sat down and had a heart to heart and said, oh, here's the terrible thing I did when I was 20 that got me sentenced to community service. I'm not going to tell you that. But I'm not. But but what I will do is, if you're living with me and we're shoulder to shoulder, I'll show you. You know what I mean? We're going to ultimately show each other what we really are,
and be mutually vulnerable. And accepting.
That's right.
And kind. You talk about compassion here too. Let's talk a little bit. You know, this world that we're living in right now, I mean, it is so void of compassion. You know, especially when I see things on you know, Facebook and stuff like that. Compassion is really something that you have to have for yourself, right? You talk about that in the book. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'll tell you something funny. So I'm from California, and somehow I slipped through the cracks and got my family to California for the holidays, right? Like miracle of miracles, right? Whatever. We got there, we had a nice time. We went flying back on Saturday night on New Year's, right? We fly back on the 1st, and we get into Florida, Orlando, at like 7 a.m, only to find that every flight on planet Earth has been canceled.
Oh yeah.
So what they tell me, when are they going to get me back to New York City? Tuesday night. This is Sunday morning with 2 kids. So I'm like, okay. So I go and I get myself, thank God, a rental car from Dollar, and I go ripping up the I-95. But there's a torrential rainstorm on the I-95 in Georgia. So we pull over. We weren't going to. We were going to go 69. The next day we wake up, the car won't start. So we call AAA, and they come and they start the car. So we get back on I-95 just in time to hit that snowstorm that caused a 20-hour traffic jam. Now, here's what I'll tell you about compassion. We only got 10 hours of it because we found this little detour, but 10 hours stuck in a car going 10 miles was a nightmare. I mean, it was just—
with 2 kids.
I had to cancel my Monday, had to cancel all my clients, had to cancel interviews. I mean, all kinds of stuff, right, for the book. But I'll tell you something that was a miracle. The compassion on that highway was at its height. Every single time somebody wiped out, every single time someone couldn't get started, somebody came tearing out of their car to push. 4 guys
Wow.
pushing my car when I got a call from a guy named Errol Collins, who also has a great radio show. And I'm on the radio with Errol Collins going, hey, Errol, I'm not sure about this interview because 4 amazing men and my 2 young kids are pushing a car out of a snowbank. And he's like, hey, Mark, you're recording right now, so let's keep going. So, I mean, again, maybe there's a silver lining here. And the silver lining is that maybe us human beings, like, we're having a hard time accessing compassion because it's scary to open ourselves up to each other. Because compassion also means that I relate to you through empathy. I don't just jump into your emotional experience, into your mind, and I get into my deepest fear and my deepest pain to reach you because I care for you. I care for you. So compassion is very costly in that interesting sense, because I can't just be compassionate by being nice and kind to you. I'm also compassionate by relating to you. And that's why this compassionate empathy that we talk about in the book as a cure is an action. It's not a thought. It's not a feeling. It's the action. It's the 4 guys and my 2 kids pushing that car out of a snowbank. And we were in a freaking sedan. We were not in a snowmobile. So we needed a lot of help up the I-95 on Monday.
Wow. That's a beautiful, that's a beautiful story, though. That warms my heart to hear that, because when I see things on Facebook, I don't see a lot of compassion. So I think that that is kind of attenuated when you're with humans, like you were actually with humans and not just in front of a computer.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
I think that's the difference. But we are just out of time. What a beautiful way to end it, though.
So wonderful to see you. It's so wonderful. It's wonderful to talk to you, but it's also wonderful to see you today.
Yeah, yes. So I really have enjoyed this book. I love the exercises. I'm going to continue to do them with myself and with my husband, because I think it's a way for us to really connect and have that intimacy and have that, you know, deal with our craziness, So
and share the compassionate empathy with each other, right?
Yes,
because that is a reciprocal thing. Compassionate empathy requires the participation of all of us, right?
Right. And be accepting of each other for whatever we're feeling and whatever we went through. So so making your crazy work for you, from trauma and isolation to self-acceptance and love. And Mark B. Borg and a PhD, and Grant H. Brenner and Daniel Berry, RN, wonderful, wonderful authors. Great book. Thank you so much. And Happy New Year. I'm glad you made it back to New York City. Oh, goodness.
I couldn't be prouder of my kids. I couldn't be prouder. I love these kids. I can't believe what they endured and how they went through it. They were just unbelievably wonderful.
Well, that's wonderful. And I'm sure that you've told them that too.
Many times. Yeah. And my wife as well. I mean, we were like such partners.
Yeah, that's so good. That's something you'll always remember, and you will laugh at. You didn't laugh at it at the time, but I'm sure even next year you'll say, remember last year when we were stuck on the 995? Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And we look forward to the next book. Okay.
I can't wait to see you again. Take good care.
Thank you so much. You take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.